three greatest Native American last stands in history. Dark blood soaked into the cold earth as Spanish soldiers hacked off Galvarino's hands. The dull thud of steel meeting flesh echoed 3 times for each hand. Bones splintered, tendons severed, yet the Mapuche warrior's obsidian eyes remained sharp, unwavering, boring into Commander Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza's skull. Not a single tear fell. "I will have my revenge," Galvarino growled, his voice raw with fury. Blood dripped from his mutilated wrists, each crimson drop marking the soil like a promise. The Spanish soldiers shifted uneasily as their prisoner rose to his feet, his shoulders straight and proud, despite the agony that must have been coursing through his body. That vow wasn't merely the cry of a tortured man. It was an echo that would resonate through centuries of native resistance. From the smoking ruins of Aztec temples to the blood-soaked battlefields of Chile and the scorched Mexican deserts, Indigenous warriors would wage desperate battles not for glory or conquest, but for survival itself. They were free peoples, facing an overwhelming tide of European steel, gunpowder, and disease. The Incas would fall despite their vast armies. The Cherokee would be driven from their ancestral lands. The Apache would fight to the last bullet in the desert heat. Each tribe wrote their own chapter in blood and defiance, choosing to die on their feet rather than live in chains. But it began here, with a warrior's mutilated hands and an unbreakable spirit. This is the story of how Native Americans faced impossible odds, fighting battles they knew they couldn't win, yet refused to surrender without leaving their mark on history. 12,000 years ago, massive hooves thundered across the frozen land bridge between Asia and North America. These weren't the familiar buffalo of the American plains. These were bison latifrons, prehistoric giants with horns spanning 7 feet across. Their breath frosted in the frigid air as they carved paths through snow and ice, unwittingly laying trails that the first humans would follow into a new world. These early migrants tracked the herds across the Bering Land Bridge, their foot wrappings crunching through fresh snow as they carried children and supplies on their backs. Stone spears and carefully preserved fire embers were their only protection against the hostile environment. But within their minds lay something far more precious, the seeds of cultures that would flourish across 2 continents. As millennia passed, these nomadic bands evolved into distinct civilizations. In the valleys of Mexico, Aztec stonemasons carved massive calendar wheels from solid rock, while astronomers tracked celestial movements with remarkable precision. Their merchants traded obsidian blades and colorful quetzal feathers in bustling markets where 60,000 people gathered daily. The air filled with the scent of roasting corn and the melodic sound of Nahuatl poetry. Further south, Incan engineers transformed mountainsides into agricultural terraces, their precise stonework fitting so tightly that not even a knife blade could slip between blocks. Their runners carried messages along 24,000 miles of carefully maintained roads, relay stations spaced exactly 1 day's journey apart. A sophisticated quipu system, intricate knots tied in colored cords, recorded everything from tax records to historical events. Yet not all chose the path of empire building. Across the North American plains, Lakota hunters developed a deep spiritual and practical relationship with the buffalo. Their teepees could be dismantled in minutes, the entire camp moving with the herds. Children learned to ride almost before they could walk, their lives guided by the natural rhythms of the seasons. In the northeastern woodlands, the Iroquois created a different model of civilization. Their longhouses sheltered extended families under single roofs, while their political system, the Great Law of Peace, united 5 nations under a constitution that would later influence American democracy. Women held significant political power, choosing chiefs and having the authority to remove them if they failed their duties. Each group adapted perfectly to their environment, developing sophisticated technologies that modern archaeologists are still working to understand. The Hohokam of Arizona engineered hundreds of miles of irrigation canals precisely graded to control water flow. The Mississippian cultures built enormous earthen mounds that required millions of basket loads of soil, carefully selected and layered for structural stability. But it was their very freedom, the ability to live according to their own traditions and move across vast territories, that would ultimately work against them. Unlike the centralized European kingdoms, with their standing armies and rigid hierarchies, Native American societies emphasized individual autonomy and consensus-based decision-making. Warriors fought for personal honor and tribal defense, not territorial conquest. A Lakota warrior might ride hundreds of miles to count coup on an enemy, touching them with a stick rather than killing them, a display of skill valued more highly than lethal force. Cherokee councils would debate for days until reaching unanimous agreement, valuing harmony over swift action. This independence and flexibility, which served them so well for millennia, would prove catastrophically ill-suited for resisting a unified European invasion. The signs of impending change were there, hidden in plain sight. Trade goods from distant tribes brought occasional tales of pale-skinned strangers in huge canoes with cloth wings. But how could any people comprehend the magnitude of what was coming? What dreams or nightmares could have prepared them for horses, gunpowder, and invisible killers floating in the air they breathed? The world changed on October 12, 1492, though the indigenous peoples of the Americas wouldn't immediately realize it. As Columbus's ships dropped anchor off San Salvador, they unleashed something far deadlier than Spanish swords or matchlock guns, microscopic killers that would reshape the human geography of two continents. Smallpox spread ahead of the conquistadors like an invisible flame. Villages went silent as the disease burned through populations with no immunity. Survivors emerged from their homes to find entire communities decimated. The mortality rate reached 90% in some areas, far exceeding Europe's Black Death, which had killed only 1/3 of the population. Aztec records speak of bodies piling so high that people couldn't drag them away fast enough. We could only wrap them in blankets, drag them to the edge of the platform, and throw them down. Behind this wave of disease came men in steel armor, riding creatures the natives had never seen. Spanish horses thundered across landscapes where no hooves had trod for 10,000 years. The psychological impact was devastating. How do you fight warriors who seem to be half man, half beast? The Spanish cannons and arquebuses only reinforced the impression of supernatural power. The Battle of Cajamarca in 1532 illustrated the shocking disparity in military technology. The Inca Emperor Atahualpa arrived for a diplomatic meeting with 80,000 warriors nearby, confident in his overwhelming numerical superiority. Francisco Pizarro had only 168 men, but they were men armed with Toledo steel, wheelocks, and the tactical advantages of horses. Atahualpa's litter-bearers wore ceremonial armor of gold and silver, beautiful but useless against Spanish crossbow bolts. His warriors carried bronze-tipped spears and slings that could barely dent steel breastplates. When Pizarro sprung his trap, Spanish artillery turned the narrow plaza into a killing ground. Gun smoke and screams filled the air as thousands of Inca warriors tried to reach the Spanish through a storm of lead balls and crossbow bolts. Within hours, 2,000 Inca lay dead, while the Spanish suffered not a single fatality. Yet the true horror lay in what this battle represented: the vulnerability of even the mightiest Native American empire to European military technology. Inca warriors were brave and skilled, their empire sophisticated and wealthy. None of that mattered against steel, gunpowder, and ruthless tactics honed in European wars. Atahualpa was captured, and despite his people paying a ransom room filled with gold, the Spanish garroted him anyway. The pattern would repeat across the Americas. Native weapons, obsidian-edged clubs, stone-tipped arrows, wooden shields proved tragically inadequate against European arms. Traditional tactics of ritual warfare and single combat meant nothing to enemies who fought to annihilate. Even when natives acquired guns and horses themselves, the technological and organizational gap proved almost impossible to close. Yet even in these darkest moments, indigenous resistance never fully died. The Mapuche of Chile would fight the Spanish to a standstill. The Apache would become masters of guerrilla warfare. The Comanche would build an empire on horseback. But they were swimming against a tide of history that would ultimately prove unstoppable, though not before warriors like Galvarino wrote their names in blood across its pages. 22 days after Galvarino's mutilation, knives gleamed in the pre-dawn light, not held in his hands, but strapped directly to his scarred wrists. Leather thongs bound the blades tightly to his arms, the freshly sharpened edges catching the first rays of sunlight. Around him, 100 Mapuche warriors painted their faces with red ochre, preparing for battle. "Look at what they've done to our brother," the tribal chief Calpolican spoke, his voice carrying across the gathering warriors. "The Spanish think they can break us with their cruelty, but they don't understand. Each drop of Mapuche blood they spill only feeds the roots of our resistance." Galvarino raised his mutilated arms, the blades extending like metal claws. "My hands may be gone," his voice rang out clear and strong, "but my heart still beats with the blood of our ancestors. Today we show these invaders that a Mapuche warrior needs no hands to fight." The Spanish never expected to see Galvarino again. They certainly never imagined he would return as the leader of an ambush force at the Battle of Milirapue. The Mapuche warriors moved silently through the morning mist, their feet making no sound on the damp earth. They had studied the Spanish patrol routes, noting how the conquistadors' heavy armor slowed them in the dense Chilean forests. The first sign of attack was a rain of arrows that seemed to materialize from the fog itself. Spanish horses reared in panic, their iron shoes striking sparks from rocks as they tried to turn in the narrow valley. The sound of steel meeting steel rang out as Mapuche warriors burst from their hiding places. In the chaos, a terrible figure emerged, Galvarino, charging straight at the Spanish lieutenant who had overseen his mutilation. The officer's eyes widened in horror as he recognized the warrior he thought he had crippled. "Impossible," he gasped, raising his sword. But Galvarino had learned to fight anew. The blades strapped to his arms moved with deadly precision, faster than any sword. He ducked under the lieutenant's wild swing and struck with both arms, the knives finding gaps in the Spaniard's armor. The lieutenant's scream was cut short as he fell from his horse. For a brief moment, victory seemed possible. The Spanish formation had broken, their carefully ordered ranks dissolving into individual fights against warriors who knew every tree and rock. But then came the sound that had shattered native armies across 2 continents, the thunder of Spanish artillery. The conquistadors had learned from previous encounters. When the Mapuche attack came, they quickly regrouped into defensive circles, their arquebusiers protected behind walls of shields. The morning air filled with the acrid smell of gunpowder as they began systematic volleys into the charging warriors. Galvarino urged his men forward, leading by example. "Better to die fighting than live as slaves," he shouted, charging through the gunsmoke. But steel and gunpowder proved stronger than courage and righteous anger. The Spanish counterattack was methodical and devastating. By sunset, the ground was littered with 3,000 Mapuche bodies. The Spanish losses numbered barely 50. Among the captured warriors lay Galvarino, his makeshift weapons finally torn from his arms, but his spirit still unbroken. Garcia Hurtado de Mendoza himself came to see the captured warrior who had caused him so much trouble. "You could have lived peacefully under Spanish rule," the commander said, studying the defiant prisoner. "Why choose death instead?" Galvarino spat at Mendoza's feet. "You speak of peace while standing on stolen land," he replied. "Your peace is slavery dressed in fine words. The Mapuche would rather die free than live under your chains." Mendoza ordered an exemplary punishment. The next morning, as the sun painted the Andes Mountains gold, Galvarino was dragged before the remaining captured warriors. The Spanish commander's hunting dogs strained at their leashes, their barks echoing off the valley walls. Some accounts claim Galvarino was hanged first, then fed to the dogs. Others insist he was thrown to them alive. The truth died with him that morning, but his final act of defiance lived on in Mapuche oral history. He walked proudly to his death, singing a war song that would be passed down through generations. The Spanish thought Galvarino's execution would break the Mapuche resistance. They were wrong. His death became a rallying cry, a symbol of indigenous resistance that would echo through centuries. The Mapuche, unlike many other native peoples, would never be fully conquered. For the next 300 years, they held the Spanish and later the Chilean state at bay along the Biobío River. Their tactical knowledge of the terrain, guerrilla warfare techniques, and fierce determination made them one of the few indigenous peoples to successfully resist European colonization. Modern historians debate the exact details of Galvarino's story. The primary source, Alonso de Ercila's epic poem La Araucana, may have embellished certain elements. But archaeological evidence supports the broad strokes, the battle sites, the casualty numbers, the Spanish tactics of mutilation as psychological warfare. What's beyond dispute is the Mapuche's exceptional resistance. While mighty empires like the Aztec and Inca fell within years of European contact, the Mapuche maintained their independence until 1881, making them one of the last indigenous peoples in the Americas to be formally incorporated into a European-derived nation-state. Today, the Mapuche continue their struggle for autonomy and land rights in Chile. Modern protesters carry banners bearing Galvarino's image, a reminder that resistance to oppression knows no timeline. The warrior who fought with knives strapped to his severed wrists has become an immortal symbol of indigenous pride and defiance against overwhelming odds. The drums of European wars echoed across the Atlantic, drawing Native Americans into conflicts that were not their own. French muskets and powder flowed to their allied tribes, while British traders supplied their indigenous partners. The forests of North America became a chessboard where European powers maneuvered native pawns against each other, transforming traditional tribal rivalries into proxy wars that would reshape the continent. King William's War, Queen Anne's War, King George's War, each European conflict rippled through native communities, forcing impossible choices. The French cultivated alliances through trade and religious conversion, their Jesuit missionaries learning native languages and customs. They built a network of trading posts where tribes could exchange furs for firearms, metal tools, and wool blankets. French officers even adopted native warfare tactics, leading mixed units of colonial militia and indigenous warriors on lightning raids against British settlements. British colonists offered similar deals, though their appetite for land often strained relationships. They established frontier trading posts where natives could acquire muskets, powder, and lead shot. But unlike the French, who were primarily interested in trade, British settlers hungered for territory. Each new settlement pushed the frontier further west, encroaching on native hunting grounds. The Abenaki people of present-day Maine and New Hampshire found themselves caught in this deadly game. French traders supplied them with modern flintlock muskets, superior to the matchlocks still carried by many British militia. The weapons were lighter, more reliable in wet weather, and could fire faster. In exchange, the French expected the Abenaki to defend their interests against British expansion. The strategy proved effective. Abenaki warriors became skilled with European weapons while maintaining their superior woodland tactics. They could move silently through dense forest, where British troops stumbled blindly. Their war parties struck without warning, using terrain and weather to their advantage. A typical raid might begin with a volley of musket fire from multiple directions, creating chaos and confusion before warriors melted back into the forest. When Dummer's War erupted in 1722, scores of small skirmishes erupted along the frontier. The Abenaki, led by Chief Paugus, struck isolated settlements and hunting parties. Their knowledge of the terrain made them fearsome opponents. They could fire 3 shots and vanish into the forest before British militia could even form ranks. The sound of war whoops echoing through the trees struck terror into colonial settlements. The pivotal moment came near present-day Fryeburg, Maine. A lone Abenaki scout encountered a British hunting party led by John Lovewell. The scout managed to fire a fatal shot at Lovewell before succumbing to return fire. The gunshots drew Chief Paugus and 70 warriors to the scene, their moccasined feet moving silently through the underbrush. What followed was an 11-hour firefight that would become legendary in colonial history. The British, now led by Ensign Wyman, took cover behind trees and rocks. The Abenaki used their superior numbers to try flanking maneuvers, but accurate British musket fire kept them at bay. The air filled with gunsmoke and war cries, the sharp crack of muskets echoing off the hills. Then came a moment that would pass into frontier legend. Chief Paugus and John Chamberlain found themselves face to face, barely 30 paces apart. Both men raised their muskets and pulled their triggers. Both guns misfired, fouled from hours of continuous shooting. The forest fell silent as warriors on both sides watched what happened next. Instead of rushing each other with knives or seeking cover, both men walked to a nearby creek to clean their weapons. Their warriors watched in stunned silence as the two enemies knelt side by side, working to clear their musket barrels. Perhaps it was a display of mutual respect, or perhaps both men simply understood that whoever cleaned and reloaded first would live. "Me kill you now," Paugus declared as he finished priming his pan, his voice carrying across the now silent battlefield. But Chamberlain had learned an old hunter's trick. He struck his musket butt against a rock, allowing loose powder to filter into the firing pan. His shot roared out a split second before Paugus could fire, striking the chief through the heart. The death of Paugus marked a turning point not just in the battle, but in the larger story of native resistance. The Abenaki melted back into the forest, eventually choosing neutrality over continued warfare. They had learned a bitter lesson. European alliances brought European weapons, but also European wars. Their independence, once their greatest strength, had become a liability in a world increasingly dominated by colonial powers. This pattern would repeat across North America. Tribes that allied with Europeans gained temporary advantages, but ultimately lost their autonomy. Those who tried to remain neutral found themselves squeezed between expanding colonial frontiers. The very weapons and trade goods that made resistance possible also created devastating dependencies on European supply lines. The age of independent native nations was drawing to a close, not with a decisive battle, but through 1,000 small compromises and dependencies that slowly transformed free peoples into dependent allies. The winter of 1838 painted a cruel portrait of America's broken promises. Cherokee families huddled together in makeshift camps, their breath freezing in the bitter air. Congress had passed the Indian Removal Act 8 years earlier, but the Cherokee had believed in American justice. They had won their case in the Supreme Court. They had adopted European customs, created their own written language, published their own newspaper. None of it mattered. They told us we could appeal to their courts. Chief John Ross spoke to his gathered people, his voice heavy with resignation. They told us we could become civilized, but their promises vanish like morning mist when gold is discovered in our hills. Federal troops arrived at dawn on May 23, 1838. They surrounded Cherokee homes with bayonets fixed, giving families minutes to gather what they could carry. Children were pulled from their beds, elders forced from homes they had built with their own hands. One soldier would later write in his diary, "I fought through the Civil War and have seen men shot to pieces and slaughtered by thousands, but the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work I ever knew." The forced march west became known as the Trail of Tears. 4,000 Cherokee, nearly a quarter of the tribe, died along the way. Pneumonia and dysentery swept through the columns of walking people. The winter ground was too frozen to dig proper graves. Mothers carried dead babies for days, unable to bear leaving them unburied by the roadside. Those who survived found their promised land in Oklahoma was nothing like the fertile valleys they had left behind. The soil was poor, the water scarce, yet even this bitter consolation would prove temporary. As one Cherokee elder observed, "They promise us this land forever, but forever grows shorter with each passing year." 3 decades later, the pattern repeated with the Warm Springs Apache and their leader, Chief Victorio. The federal government promised them a reservation at Ojo Caliente, New Mexico, part of their ancestral homeland. The agreement was spelled out in careful legal language, printed on thick paper, and signed with flourishing signatures. Victorio studied the document with skeptical eyes. "The white man's word is as worthless as his paper," he told his council. "When wet, both dissolve into nothing." His prophecy would prove tragically accurate. The first winter at Ojo Caliente brought harsh lessons in government promises. The promised blankets never arrived. Food rations were half what was promised, often spoiled. Apache children shivered in threadbare clothes while government agents claimed paperwork delays. "Look at how they honor their treaties," Victorio spoke bitterly to his people. "They promise us food, yet our children go hungry. They promise us blankets, yet we freeze. They promise us peace, yet their soldiers watch us like hawks circling dying prey." The situation deteriorated further when gold was discovered nearby. Within months, the government announced the Apache would be relocated, first to the Tularosa Valley, then to San Carlos, then back to Ojo Caliente. Each move brought new promises. Each promise proved as empty as the last. At San Carlos, malaria swept through the tribe. The heat was unbearable, the water brackish. When they begged to return to their homeland, officials responded with more papers, more promises, more delays. Apache warriors, who had never begged for anything in their lives, found themselves reduced to pleading for basic necessities. By 1879, rumors circulated of yet another forced relocation. Victorio gathered his people one last time. "They speak of peace while stealing our land," he declared. "They talk of civilization while treating us worse than animals. We have tried their way. Now we will return to ours." The next day, Victorio and 150 warriors left the reservation. They would spend their remaining days as fugitives in their own ancestral lands, hunted by the very government that had promised to protect them. Their story would merge with the larger tragedy of Native American displacement, a trail of broken promises that stretched from sea to shining sea. In the end, the Trail of Tears and Victorio's struggles illuminated a bitter truth. In the clash between Native American sovereignty and American expansion, no piece of paper, no court decision, no promise or treaty could stand against the tide of settler colonialism. The only options left were submission or resistance, and for warriors like Victorio, the choice was clear. The year 1879 marked the beginning of Victorio's final campaign. His band of 150 Apache warriors moved like shadows through the mountains between New Mexico and Mexico, striking settlements and vanishing before military forces could respond. Their raids were precise, tactical, each one securing the ammunition and supplies needed to continue their resistance. General George Crook, who had spent years fighting the Apache, described them as tigers of the human species. A soldier's diary entry captured their effectiveness. You never see them coming. The first sign is the whistle of arrows or the crack of rifles. By the time you locate the sound, they're gone, leaving only dead men behind. Victorio's guerrilla tactics proved remarkably successful. His warriors could cover 60 miles a day on foot, disappearing into terrain where cavalry horses foundered. They used complex systems of scouts and signals, coordinating their movements across vast distances. When cornered, they would split into smaller groups, only to reunite at predetermined locations weeks later. One of Victorio's most effective strategies was his use of water sources. He maintained a mental map of every spring, creek, and hidden waterhole across thousands of square miles of desert. His band could travel through seemingly waterless terrain while pursuing armies watched their horses die of thirst. "Water is life," Victorio would tell his warriors, "and knowledge of water is power." The Apache's ability to strike and disappear became legendary. They would attack from high ground, using the sun to blind their targets. They practiced shooting from horseback at full gallop, a skill that made them lethal raiders. Their knowledge of terrain allowed them to set up ambushes, where pursuing forces had no choice but to walk into their trap. But in October 1880, their luck ran out at Tres Castillos in the northern Mexican state of Chihuahua. The landscape offered 3 small mountains rising about 100 feet above an open plain, with scattered caves and rock formations providing natural defensive positions. Victorio chose this position for its defensibility, but he had made a rare tactical error. The open plain made it impossible to slip away undetected. Colonel Joaquin Terrazas, leading 250 Mexican soldiers, had studied Apache warfare methods. He positioned his forces carefully, cutting off all escape routes before revealing his presence. His men had orders to conserve ammunition and maintain constant pressure without fully engaging, a strategy designed to wear down the Apache's limited supplies. The battle began at dawn, with Apache scouts firing warning shots from the heights. Victorio's warriors quickly took up defensive positions, using generations of knowledge about desert warfare. They built rock barricades, established crossfire zones, and positioned their best marksmen to cover likely approach routes. "Hold your ground," Victorio's voice carried across the rocks. Every bullet must find its mark. The Apache made each shot count, knowing their ammunition was limited. Their accuracy was devastating. Any Mexican soldier who exposed himself for even a moment risked instant death from Apache rifles. The morning stretched into afternoon under the scorching desert sun. Mexican forces probed the Apache defenses, losing men to precise rifle fire, but gradually tightening their encirclement. Victorio's warriors fought with the desperate skill of men defending their families. Women and children huddled in caves behind the fighting positions. By late afternoon, the situation had become critical. Apache ammunition began running low. The pop of rifle fire became increasingly sporadic. Mexican forces pressed closer, using the Apache's own tactics of moving from cover to cover. The defenders began resorting to bows and arrows, then to throwing rocks. As darkness approached, Terrazas ordered his men to prepare for a final assault. What happened next remains disputed. Some accounts claim Victorio mounted his horse and charged the Mexican lines, choosing a warrior's death. Others say he was wounded and executed. But the most widely accepted version, passed down through Apache oral tradition, tells that Victorio took his own knife and plunged it into his heart, refusing to become a prisoner in his own lands. The battle's toll was devastating. 62 Apache warriors dead, 68 captured. Mexican losses numbered fewer than 10. Among the dead lay Victorio, the 55-year-old chief who had led one of the last great Native American resistance movements. The prisoners, mostly women and children, faced a harsh march to distant reservations. The impact of Tres Castillos rippled through Native American communities. The death of Victorio represented more than the loss of a skilled leader. It symbolized the closing of an era. The Apache way of life, based on freedom of movement and martial skill, was becoming impossible in a world of railways, telegraphs, and repeating rifles. Yet the spirit of native resistance didn't die. The legendary Geronimo would continue fighting until 1886. The Bronco Apache would maintain their independence even longer, hiding in the most remote mountain ranges. A veteran cavalry officer would later write, "They were never conquered, only outnumbered. Even in defeat, they remained unconquered in spirit." These stories live on in modern movements for indigenous rights. In Chile, Mapuche communities invoke Galvarino's name as they fight for land rights. Across both American continents, native peoples maintain their languages and traditions, refusing to disappear into the mainstream of settler societies. These warriors, Galvarino with his bladed arms, Paugus at his creekside duel, Victorio in his mountain stronghold, represent an unbroken line of resistance that continues today. Their stories remind us that freedom comes at a price, and some will pay any cost to remain true to themselves. Join us at Native Legends and History Stories as we uncover more untold tales of indigenous resistance and survival. Subscribe now to explore the rich tapestry of Native American heritage, one story at a time.